to you as far as the ambassador is concerned.
Thank you so much. And the last speaker, I will take it from Terry, who said abolish injustice everywhere. And as an organization which promotes democracy, and we are covered by the first amendment, which is the freedom to express and share the ideas. My last speaker will be Ambassador Kayumba. Ambassador Kayumba holds a Bachelor of Arts in Law, a Master's in Global Security. He's the former Rwandan ambassador to India and former Army of Chief for Rwanda. So please allow me to welcome Ambassador Kayumba, and he's going to discuss what was the Marshall Plan of Germany, what were the enabling factors, what were the failures. Can Africa do the Marshall Plan? Yes or not? And without taking long, Ambassador Kayumba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam. And thanks so much for all the participants. It's a pleasure being with you today. And I don't want to go back and reintroduce myself. And without much ado, I'll be doing my presentation with PowerPoint so that you could both share the screen. Right, thank you so much. Obviously, the Marshall Plan is the rehabilitation of Europe after the Second World War. And with the COVID-19, we are thinking how could Africa also be able to benefit from such a kind of financial assistance to be able to develop Africa after the devastating COVID-19. But in order to do that, one has first of all to ask himself, is debt cancellation a feasible proposition for Africa? Is it feasible? Number two, who would fund the package, the Marshall Plan for Africa? Who would do it? And thirdly, would we be able to compare the COVID-19 devastation with the Second World War? Now, when you do that, you have to look at the imperatives that informed the Marshall Plan. First of all, the Marshall Plan, okay, go up. Well, the Marshall Plan was informed by a number of imperatives. Number one, it was the political imperative, which was mainly the trial to unify Europe through economic integration on the US model, meaning that the intention was to build the United States of Europe with the help of America. The second consideration was the ideological reason, and the ideological reason was to fight communism. At that time, communism had started spreading in the parts of Eastern Europe, and Western Europe and America was afraid of communism. And therefore, they had to find a way of fighting communism. The third element was the social element, especially a lot of European immigration to the United States. Who supported? They supported the Marshall Plan, and particularly that's why they came up with a bipartisan approval of the Marshall Plan. However, there's another underpin, which was the economic underpin, and that was to boost exports and imports from America to Europe and vice versa. We should also recall that there was also a diplomatic reason, because America had been in isolation. There was therefore an intention for America to place itself at the center of diplomacy in view of the fact that the Soviet Union was trying to impose itself on Europe. So America wanted to impose itself on Europe also. And thirdly, there was the problem that existed between the Soviet Union and the Allied forces and the blockade of Germany. And they had to create West Germany to make sure that countries like France, Greece, and Italy, which had communistic parties, had to be stopped, the spread of communism. And of course, there was the issue of security, because after Second World War, what would follow? Would therefore have Europe that would be fragmented? There was therefore a reason for them to create a security arena, and that security arena was meant to create NATO. In that regard, we look at those imperatives as the reason why the Marshall Plan was created. Now, let's look now at what is taking place. Try to look at what's taking place now in Africa. When you look at Africa, there is a little bit of a difference. The African Union is a loose kind of organization. European countries and America in particular would prefer to deal with individual countries instead of dealing with the African Union as a whole. In terms of economics, while there was an intention to build the European Union and to integrate European countries, in Africa, America prefers to deal with Africa on an individual basis through AGOA, the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. Instead of working together with Africa, they prefer to work with countries separately. Then there is a social kind of situation. While it was very easy, and a lot of Europeans after the Second World War were encouraged to migrate to Europe and America. Today in America, you see these issues of the immigration and the customs enforcement, ICE, trying to block people from Africa and other countries to migrate to America and other places. And certainly the question of communism is no longer there. There is no ideological reason that communism could be stopped, let me say, in Africa. And therefore that would encourage either Europe or America to work on a Marshall Plan. Then when it comes to security, while America was looking and Europe were trying to build NATO, in Africa, what we have is the AFRICOM. The AFRICOM is not based in Africa. It's based in Germany, in Stuttgart. And they just only deploy troops in Africa. We don't have forces in Africa that would force either America or Europe to be able to build a Marshall Plan for Africa for security reasons. And lastly, there is the diplomatic level. On diplomacy, America or Europe, they prefer to deal with Africa either through the State Department or through AFRICOM, and maybe through the UN, because America and the European countries, some of them are part of the permanent members. So they really don't need to establish themselves and look at Africa as a totality. They prefer to deal with Africa as a single states. So these are the impediments that you look at that would not be able to encourage either America or Europe to look at the Marshall Plan. However, when you look at Africa, what does it present? When you look at the slide on the right, you can see Africa is a myriad of disjointed nations. While after the Second World War, Europe was more or less integrated as states politically and economically almost homogeneous. Then there is a question of the deficit, political deficit in Africa and the problems of accountability. Yet that was not the situation that pertains after the Second World War. We also look at the situation of the multilateral debt relief of 2005, a lot of countries in Africa, the debt was completely wiped out. But what is the situation today? The situation today is that countries are more indebted than they were in 2005. And that's not encouraging for anybody to think about a Marshall Plan for Africa, because a lot of African countries have also accumulated a lot of debt. So people also look at what is the role of business in Africa. You find the amount of money that's given to Africa does not go to business. A lot of it goes to the ruling elite, and a lot of it is sometimes swindled and put into foreign banks. So these are some of the problems that Africa has. However, when you look on the other side, you'll see Africa is trying to make sure that we move towards a situation that would be conducive for us to be able to have a situation that a Marshall Plan could be possible. And what is that? You can see there is a tendency to move towards effective systems of governance, to make in Africa a place to live, a place to work, and a place to invest. And some countries, not all of them, in Africa have actually made strides towards that direction. There is private sector innovation and finance. If you look at certain countries, particularly in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, you can see there is a lot of innovation and finance going into it and building a private sector. However, we need to accelerate industrial development so that we can go to curb on export of raw materials and processed commodities, and also vulnerability against external and internal shocks. And this is a big problem. We also need to make sure that we build on gender equality and the empowerment of women and youth, because this forms the majority of our population, and we need to empower the majority of our population, and that's the women and the youth. And then move towards regional integration to be able to create a common market for Africa. And in order to do that, in order to look at climatic change, social development, data development, and then build an African continental free trade area. Now, these are the issues, if put together, would be able to entice and encourage investment in Africa, just like America was encouraged to invest in Europe after the Second World War. Now, when we do this, we look at the assumptions. There are a number of assumptions when you look at what can happen. And some of the assumptions are, do we have resources? Who is going to give the resources? Because today, when you look at America, the understanding, and particularly diplomatically, the policies are much more about America instead of looking at the whole world. Because if you look at what has taken place in America, it seems like America is now withdrawing again towards isolation instead of becoming an international leader. At the same time, we look at the capacity of the African countries. Do they have the capacity to absorb these loans? Some of them, yes. Some of them, no. And because Africa is not an integrated country, then you have these problems, because some countries can absorb, others cannot absorb. I had already talked about the question of indebtedness. I don't have to repeat. And then when you are going to allocate these resources, how do you allocate these resources? We must have empirical economic data that can be used to be able to know where these resources should be allocated. Then the question of monitoring. And also, we must recognize that when our resources are given to Africa, we have a lot of foreign consultants, people who go consulting and they take 30, 40% of the resources. Now, when we look at when the Marshall Plan was instituted, there were no such consultants that had to go and take money from Europe, except the 5% that was given the CIA to fight communism. So now, when we look at this, we have to compare it now with the COVID. What are you going to do with the COVID? Because we have COVID coming in, and we have to deal with the situation. And this is a comparative analysis. We look at the comparative analysis of COVID and the World War II as a precursor to be able to look at how you can be able to convince that we need a Marshall Plan. Number one, so many people, the fatalities, the people who died during the Second World War, we believe COVID won't kill so many to be able to attract this kind of situation. Number two, the Second World War completely destroyed the infrastructure in Europe, but COVID has kept the infrastructure intact. While you have lost people, not so many, but infrastructure remains intact. And therefore, people can go to pick the capacities very quickly. The next thing is that the Second World War took 5 years, and maybe COVID may take a year, because we are told that within 1 year, we may have a vaccine. But the most important, the United States of America provided the resources for the Marshall Plan. In this kind of situation, whom do we envisage to provide the resources? Particularly when the world is becoming towards much more of a popularist and some kind of nationalistic thinking. So who is going to provide the resources? Now, we have to go now to the aftermath of COVID. Having seen all this, what is the aftermath of COVID? The most likelihood in Africa is that there could be a rollback. There could be a rollback on the democracy that had already been obtained. We have seen certain countries, they have brought in laws, regulations that are so draconian. In which case, therefore, what do we expect to happen? You can see that certain countries that even refuse to have any regulations, and Tanzania, Burundi, these people have not had any regulations. Now, what is the accountability there? So there could be a rollback on the gains on democracy. Number two, there could be a pushback from the populations. Why? Because the social networks in Africa are so limited. While in Europe and America, people are being paid for not working, people are being fed. In Africa, that's not the situation. Is that sustainable? Maybe after COVID, we could see a lot of riots, we could see a lot of disabilities in Africa, and this could be a big problem. And it could have some social and economic unrest in Africa. Now, the world is much more divided than it was during the Second World War. And therefore, when you look at all these things, the aftermath of COVID, it becomes very, very complicated. And of course, the rise of nationalism and popularism in Europe. Now, these are the issues that we are looking at. Now, my question I'm supposed to answer is it possible to have debt relief, debt cancellation, and then have a plan like the Marshall Plan? And I would say that it is possible that we could have, in conclusion, we could be able to have debt cancellation in Africa. But if we have a debt cancellation in Africa and the creation of a Marshall Plan, there must be conditionalities. And what are those conditionalities? Number one, governance and the rule of law. If there is no governance and the rule of law, how do you monitor, how do you run a situation like the Marshall Plan in a dictatorship? That would be very, very difficult. Number two, how do you run a Marshall Plan in a situation where economies are disjointed? That's very difficult. Number two, we must look at the human rights violations and our human rights situation. What is the point of throwing money in a state where human rights are being violated? Who are the beneficiaries? If you throw money in a country where people are being killed, who are the beneficiaries? Number three, we have to look at the current debt of a country against the GDP. If a country has a debt already which could be above 56% of its national GDP, now how do you give them money? And when you cancel the debt, when these countries already had the debt cancellation, and with that cancellation, they accumulated more debt, what tells you that when you give them more money under a so-called Marshall Plan, they won't even accumulate more debt? And that's a very big problem. So the answer therefore lies in accountability and the involvement of the private sector. If there is accountability and involvement of the private sector, then you can go talk about the Marshall Plan. And of course, the empowerment of women and the youth. This is very, very important, because when you empower women, when you empower the youth, who form the majority and who have proved, because the youth can be able to innovate. Women have proved that they can create wealth, and they are more frugal than men in Africa. And therefore, we believe that if you empower women, if we empower youth, and our Marshall Plan is moving towards that segment of society, we are likely to obtain positive results. However, we must now be able to look, when you are going to talk about Marshall Plan and the cancellation of debt, what are we talking about? We are talking about you free the interest rate now on the current debts people have, you forgive the principal payment, and then this money that has been freed can now go to development. However, and this is a caveat, there is a problem. When money is given to African countries, there are illicit flows into foreign safe havens. If you see in my slide here, in Mauritania in 2018, it was reported that $148 billion were drained out of Africa annually, and that's equivalent to 25% of the average GDP of Africa. Now, this is a very big problem. If you have countries, currently when they get aid, the aid is taken to foreign countries. It's going to be very, very complicated that even when you bring in money under the so-called Marshall Plan, money won't be stolen. However, what is my view? My view is that the Marshall Plan should be considered. The debts could be cancelled, country by country, having looked at every single country's record, and from each country's record, then you can be able to build those countries so they can be able to provide as an example for those others which are lagging behind to be able to become as case studies to be able to move. But not to look at countries, some of them which are dictatorships, some of them killing their own people, others who don't want to leave power, and we just throw money at them. That won't be good for Africa. So we support debt cancellation. We support the building of Africa on the basis of Marshall Plan, but we must be very careful in how we implement. The implementation must be very clear so that we can be able to look at country by country, because there is nothing as to say there is anything uniform about Africa, and particularly in view of the fact that what we have now and what was pertaining in the world during the World War is very different, because we don't know who would be able to give the money and who won't be able to give the money. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for speaking. Mary, we have actually 8 minutes left now before the official close.
Okay.
Do you want to give some questions to the ambassador, or do you want to have the final remarks? How would you like to proceed?
Actually, I have a question for the ambassador.
Excuse me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, so that you have seen the essence and the presentation was to give us a chance to do informed decisions as far as the Marshall Plan is concerned. And also we should know for the purposes of clarity that the Marshall Plan is a long-term goal, but the short-term goal is promoting infrastructure development on the continent, which is education, which is health infrastructure, which is clean water, and ensuring enough security on the continent. In your view, Ambassador, do you think we should even think of the Marshall Plan as a kind of type of plan that would help to be part of the socio-economic planning model for the Africa, maybe from 20 to 2060 or not?
Yes, I think, let me go to maybe another slide here. Generally, when you look at what you are talking about is, if you want to build a stable continent, you need to look at the necessities. And those would include housing, they would include education, sanitation, health, education. That's very, very important, because those are necessities, they are prerequisites. And whether in a democracy, whether in a dictatorship, all these things are necessary. So that's why I support that a Marshall Plan to Africa should be considered, but countries must be put to task to make sure that all these things are built for the people. They should be built to be able to help the population instead of being given money and the money is stolen. So definitely infrastructure that includes roads, water, railways, education is very, very important. But we must make sure that in doing that, countries which are lagging behind must be put under pressure, first of all, to increase their governance so that they can be able to get those benefits.
Okay, the next question comes from David Anga. And the question is, Ambassador, how do we unite countries, especially that African countries seem to operate independently? And you said what made the Marshall Plan to succeed was because of the collaborative effort.
Yes, you see, how African countries currently, through the African Free Trade Area and the African Union are trying to come together. They have come to a realization that fragmentation is a problem. And so they are coming together to be able to build those kind of synergies that bring together a customs union, common market, so that Africa becomes integrated. If that one is done, then what you are asking for is possible. But as long as African states are fragmented, it is very difficult because they are not united. They have got tariffs, both statutory and non-statutory tariffs, non-trade barriers. And that makes it very difficult for Africa to work together and to develop as a commonality. So it's quite important that we move towards a common market, a customs union, to make sure that it is possible to look at Africa as a totality.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Kayumba. For the listeners and participants, I take a pleasure to come from Rwanda, and he was once my leader, and we promote democracy Apparently, you have seen the tangible knowledge that he has shared. But I want also to remind the listeners that Ambassador Kayumba has survived 2 assassination attempts in South Africa. So he's a survivor, if we would so call it, but with the potential knowledge, and that shows you how much dictatorship is deadly of. Imagine wishing that such a kind of a human being shouldn't be existing. If you have seen, I had to name him different names. I did it intentionally, but I wanted freedom to be on this panel. And since we are promoting democracy and freedom, there is no way I would just say, well, he's, we are promoting equality and right to life and happiness. If we do so, we do it to all. We may disagree in ideas. We may disagree in the ideology. We may disagree in opinions. But by the end of the day, there is nobody who has got a right to take one's life off this earth just because you don't agree. That would be, take me also to the issue of racism and unrest here. My dear Americans, I am an American, a new American, but with zeal and determination to make America great. Just like I love Africa, I love America. I want to see it being a fruitful continent for all the people who are living in it. When we consider all the good things that love has brought on earth, I think we can promote love as opposed to hate. I also know that not all people in the community are bad. What happened to George Floyd, that is one apple. Not all whites are that way. I have worked with the tremendous, important, and very wonderful whites who are very wonderful and useful. We have to stand and say, if we have one apple in the community, we are not going to stand with one apple. But also, I know that our my fellow blacks, like Nelson Mandela said, when he was getting out of jail, he realized that once he does not forgive, there would have been a possibility that he was going to live under jail mentally, although he would have left jail physically. So for today, as we close the panel, I urge each black, of which I am, by the way, to forgive, because reconciliation requires two things. And I come from Rwanda. We had a war-torn country. You had the genocide. Reconciliation takes 2 people, the victor and the victim. But also to realize that that was done. You teach history as it was. You reset the mind and you build a nation. And that is my conclusive remarks for this panel. I thank you so much. Tomorrow we have another one, a wonderful one on human rights, building strong institutions. Please be part of the panel. I thank you. We are going now to give 20 minutes for the French translation for the audience that would be on this forum, and that would be Frank Jocaten. Are you there?